Hey everyone, this is a video guide to using towers in Minecraft speedruns. Towers are primarily used to get ender pearls in versions before 1.14, but before all of you 1.14 and 1.16 runners click away, I've split this video into two parts. The first part is going to be just about mob spawning and despawning mechanics and why towers work the way they do, which I think is really important knowledge for any speedrunner to know on any version, because I think some of this knowledge can be used to manipulate mob spawns in the future. The second part of this video is just going to be about actual tower builds and usage, which is just going to be primarily for pre 1.9 speedrunners. So to understand how towers work, we first have to understand how mobs spawn and despawn. I've drawn a bunch of diagrams here, which are all to scale, so you can see kind of what's going on. But here's our player Minecraft Steve here. He's on flat ground, we can say in a desert. Typical desert Y height is 70, above bedrock here at 0. And these little lines just represent different caves that can spawn beneath the player. Those are dependent on your biome and different things, but typically there's always going to be a large amount of cave positions available for mobs to spawn underneath the player. This first circle here is 24 blocks, and this indicates where mobs can spawn. Hostile mobs cannot spawn closer to the player unless it's from a mob spawner. So at 24 blocks away and onwards, mobs can spawn as long as there's a valid position for them. At 32 to 127 blocks, mobs have a chance to despawn. So based on your render distance and the version you're playing, player vision will be around 60 to 70 blocks. So you can actually see mobs in this region despawning randomly. So maybe 30 seconds or a couple minutes, a mob will just despawn and then it'll make room for a new one. At 128 blocks, mobs are actually forced to despawn. They're too far away from the player to see, so the game just says we should despawn these because they don't matter. And so if you ever go 128 blocks away from a mob, unless they're carrying a permanent item or in a boat or something, they will force despawn immediately. Another thing to mention is the mob cap, which changes based on a couple different variables. So the mob cap is going to be around 80 for hostile mobs. The exact number changes a lot, but for simplicity, it's a nice round number. I'm just going to say hostile mob cap is 80 for this whole video. So in general, this green circle will always have about 80 mobs around you. If the player immediately teleports here, the hostile mob cap of 80 will fill up under half a second. It'll fill up almost instantly. About 20% of the mobs in general will be in caves beneath you. Again, it changes a lot based on where you are, but maybe 20% of mobs underneath you. About 20% of mobs will be in the player's vision range, and then the other 60% will be far out here because the circle gets a larger and larger surface area out here and out here. So there are quite a few mobs that the player just doesn't see. I want to show this example of what happens when the player moves horizontally. So here's Steve. He's got a 128 block ring around him. If Steve moves 40 blocks to the right, we have this new blue circle which represents his mob radius. This crescent over here, this region, if there are any mobs in these caves or on the surface, will be forced to despawn. And as soon as they despawn, the mob cap will go down from 80. But when the player is moving, this new circle will populate mobs instantaneously. So for the player, it seems seamless. There are always about 80 mobs around him. He can see maybe 15 to 20 or so as he's moving horizontally. So here's an in-game example of these same ideas. I'm in creative mode right now, but if I open my F3 screen, we can actually see how many mobs are around us just from this info. I'm running version 1.8 right now, but most versions of Minecraft have this info on the F3 screen. This E means entity counter. And so the numerator here is actually how many things I can see in my field of vision. And this denominator is basically how many things are in my rendered chunk. And these numbers both count both hostile mobs, neutral mobs, and dropped items. And so because I'm in a desert, there's no real neutral mobs, and I don't have any dropped items. So essentially, these are just hostile mobs. The numerator will change depending on where I'm facing. So if I face a direction with less mobs, that numerator will change to reflect what I'm looking at. The denominator is the most important thing though, and it's actually what I look at when I'm doing towers, because it tells me how many mobs are nearby. In this case, it's going to fluctuate a little bit. It's not going to be 80 all the time, based on the version and the mode you're in and how you're running around. It's not always going to be at the mob cap, but it should be, you know, around 60 to 80 most of the time. So you see as I'm moving, it's kind of changing up and down, depending on where mobs are and how they're despawning and respawning. So right now, I mean, I can't see that many mobs around me. Most of the mobs are going to be outside of your vision range. So again, there's only going to be like 15-20 mobs if you're running around on the surface like right next to you. The vast majority of them will be pretty far, and there will be a few in caves. So maybe 10-20% of mobs will spawn beneath the surface all the way down to bedrock in places like this. So now we can see what happens if the player does this vertically as opposed to horizontally. Let's just say our player Steve has pillared up 128 blocks in the middle of the night and is just sitting here. His Y position is going to be ground level plus 128, and his red circle is now completely in the air. And so there are actually no valid positions where mobs can spawn and stick around. So what's happening is the mob is constantly and desperately trying to fill up the mob cap around you. It's spawning mobs in caves and on the surface all around here, but they're immediately despawning because they're too far from the player. And so what happens is there's essentially 0 hostile mobs in the game right now. Let's say Steve drops down to the ground. Before he even reaches the halfway point at around ground level plus 75 blocks, the mob cap is instantly filled up to 80. So now we can see his circle intersects a large part of the ground in caves, and it's a pretty significant area on the surface as well. And so because there aren't as many caves as there were when we were moving horizontally, a larger percentage of mobs spawn on the surface than they do in caves. And because our valid spawn range on the ground is not quite as far as it was before when we were standing on the ground, mobs actually spawn a little bit closer to the base of our tower. And so that's why we see a higher percentage of mobs when players drop from 128 blocks up. So we can illustrate this in game again. I'm in version 1.8. I made a basic pillar up from the ground, and here's 75 blocks above ground level. And as I go up, I'm just keeping my eye on this entity counter to make sure that the mob cap kind of goes to 0. As I get to 128 blocks, all of the mobs are forced to despawn everywhere. You'll see the entity counter bounce around a lot. It's because it's trying to spawn mobs everywhere but failing, so it's effectively 0. As I drop down to the ground and past this 75 blocks above ground level marking, we'll see the end counter basically hit a maximum and hit the mob cap. And so we get a good amount of mobs around us, a lot more than we otherwise normally would just walking horizontally. So we get a higher concentration of mobs in the surface and not too many in caves. So the basic idea of a tower is pretty simple, but honestly pretty effective. If the player can find themselves 128 blocks above the ground, it will force any mobs they don't want that are not Endermen down here to despawn. And once they fall, they'll rapidly generate mobs here, kill any Enderman they see, and as long as they can get back up to the top, they can repeat this process over and over. Falling down onto water or ladders is a pretty fast method of transportation, and dying at the bottom and respawning in a bed, it's also a pretty fast method of transportation. So the whole process is pretty quick, and it's a pretty cool idea. There is a little bit better way to do this, though. And Matthew Bolin, of course, was the one who told me this trick. I know GeoSquare and him put a good amount of time into figuring this one out. But the idea to do this better is pretty simple. Let's say instead of spawning at 128 and dropping all the way down, you drop to a ledge that's 2 blocks below you. Just 2 blocks so that you're at ground level plus 126. What's going to happen here is something a little interesting because now the circle is only 2 blocks below the surface, and so still essentially no mobs in caves will ever spawn 2 blocks below the surface. It's just not enough space. But if we look at this right triangle now that we made, 126 blocks to the ground, and the hypotenuse is 128, that actually gives us 22.5 blocks to the side of this triangle, which on the surface is where mobs can spawn. And so now there's actually a 45 block range where mobs can actually spawn right around the base of our tower. And if this could work, if we could spawn an entire mob cap directly next to the base of our tower, we would get a lot of Endermen really rapidly. But there's kind of one big issue with this idea. So I'll show you what this issue is in game, but here I am at 128 blocks above the ground. Any counter is fluctuating, but basically 0. I'm going to drop down 2 blocks and start a timer. to 126. The entity counter is going to be fluctuating, but slowly moving up towards the mob cap, so I'll stop the timer once it hits the mob cap. Basically what's happening right now is the game is trying to spawn mobs all around me, but it's immediately despawning the ones that are too far out of my radius. And so it's only keeping the ones that are very close. And so what ends up happening is the mob rate, the mob spawn rate, is directly proportional to the available space that mobs have to spawn. So right about now, it's hit the mob cap. This process takes about 30 seconds at Y126 above ground level. We'll go down and see we do have quite a lot of mobs in a pretty close area around us, a couple Endermen. So this would be a great strategy for getting mobs very, very close to the base of your tower if it didn't take around 30 seconds on average. So going back to our drawing here, we can say that at Y height, ground level plus 126, if we were to stand on this ledge, it would take about 30 seconds for 80 mobs, or the mob cap, to spawn. But we can go down further and try different ledge heights and see how long it takes mobs to spawn to the mob cap, and how far away they are from us. And again, this isn't my idea. Gio and Matthew did a lot of initial work on this, came up with their own numbers, but I did my own study and came up with a general rule of thumb that a good ledge height to build on your tower is 115 blocks above ground level. So this means if you build up your tower to 128, respawn on your bed and drop 13 blocks down, this will actually take 4 seconds for the mobs to fill up to the mob cap on average. The nice thing about this is if we only drop 13 blocks down, that means that only 13 blocks of cave space is available for mobs to spawn in. This is a pretty slim area for mobs to spawn in caves, so you're likely getting 0 mob cave spawns with this strategy. And the nice thing is with this new triangle, we get 56 blocks of horizontal surface space for mobs to spawn in. A circle of radius 56. This number is important because Enderman aggro range when you look at them is 64 blocks. So theoretically, if you're staying up here, all of the mobs, even if Endermen wander a little bit further away, should be within your aggro range when you drop to the base of the tower. So just to show you this, here we are again at 128. I'm going to drop down this ledge, start this timer. This ledge is at 115 blocks above ground level, and mob cap is reached right around there, so about 4 seconds. And then we drop down, we should see a pretty good amount of mobs. This is typically around 3 to 4 times as many mobs as if you would just drop straight down. And we see a pretty good amount of Endermen, and in theory, all these mobs, these Endermen should be closer than 60 blocks, so you could aggro them. I'm going to throw up a table of the different ledges Y heights versus the amount of seconds it takes to fill up the mob cap that I've found. Again, it's dependent on version and where your tower is and how good it is, but in general, I think it's a good rule of thumb to make a ledge on your tower anywhere between 110 and 120 blocks from ground level. It's kind of just personal preference how long you want to wait and how far you care if the Endermen are away from you, but it's kind of nice to have these mobs spawn a little bit further away, so there's not too many mobs really close to the base of your tower, because skeletons and creepers and things can cause issues. All right, so that's it for part 1. Part 2, I'm going to go over the 2 main different tower types and the 2 different versions that towers are typically used in, and I'm going to actually go through builds and usages of those towers so you can see how they work. I'll see you there.